stood at the back of the church, clutching a bouquet so tightly my knuckles were white, listening to the muffled sounds of the wedding march through the heavy oak doors. But instead of feeling like a glowing bride, I felt like a prisoner of war. My own father had just leaned in, not to kiss my cheek or tell me I looked beautiful, but to whisper that if I didn't remove my unsuitable guests from the reception list immediately, he would pull the check for the entire venue and catering right then and there. This was 10 minutes before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, and I had to decide if I would let my parents buy my soul or if I would burn the whole day down to keep my dignity. Honestly, looking at the smug expression on my mother's face as she adjusted my veil, the same woman who had spent 6 months trying to turn my wedding into a corporate networking event, I realized I was done being a puppet. Before I tell you how I handled that ultimatum and the chaos that followed when they actually saw who was sitting in the front rows, I need to ask you something. Would you let your parents control the biggest day of your life just because they were holding the credit card? Or would you risk everything to stand up for the people who actually love you? This nightmare didn't start at the church. It started the moment I got engaged to Mark. Mark is the kind of man my parents, who are high-level corporate lawyers with a penchant for social climbing, describe as quaint. He's a high school history teacher with a heart of gold and a backbone of steel, which is exactly why they hate him. From the second he put a ring on my finger, a ring he saved up for months to buy, rather than using an acceptable family heirloom, my parents, Eleanor and Richard, decided that since they were paying for the wedding, they owned the wedding. They told me from day one that their status required a certain level of elegance, which was code for, we are going to invite 200 people you've never met and treat your actual friends like second-class citizens. I tried to be grateful. I really did. I knew a wedding in the city wasn't cheap, and at first, I thought their involvement was just their way of showing love. But the rules started piling up faster than the RSVPs. First, it was the guest list. I had a core group of friends from college and my childhood who have been my literal lifelines. My best friend, Sarah, is a single mother who has worked 3 jobs to keep her head above water. My other close friend, Leo, is a brilliant artist who doesn't exactly own a tuxedo. When I handed my mother my list of 50 essential guests, she laughed. She actually laughed in my face and told me that people like that would bring down the aesthetic of the event. She replaced my best friends with her bridge club members and my father's junior partners. I fought back, of course. I spent weeks arguing over every single name. Every time I reached a breaking point, my father would remind me that they were spending $80,000 on this day, and that he who pays the piper calls the tune. It was a constant psychological grind. They micromanaged the menu, removing the comfort food mark, and I loved and replacing it with tiny, pretentious appetizers that tasted like salted foam. They even tried to dictate what Mark would wear, insisting on a specific designer suit that cost more than his car. But the biggest point of contention, the one that led to the ultimate showdown, was my special guest list. You see, I had spent the last 5 years volunteering at a local youth center and a transition house for people getting back on their feet. These people are my chosen family. They taught me more about resilience and love than my parents ever did in 24 years of sterile, calculated parenting. I wanted them there. I wanted the kids I mentored and the mentors who guided me to see me start this new chapter. My parents, however, viewed this as charity work that should stay in the slums and out of their 5-star ballroom. They explicitly forbade me from inviting them, saying it would be uncomfortable for their high society friends to mingle with that element. I pretended to agree. I nodded, I smiled, and I let them think they had won. I told them I had sent out the approved invitations and that the guest list was finalized according to their strict rules. But behind their backs, Mark and I were working on a plan. We knew that if we did this their way, we would look back on our wedding day with nothing but resentment. So we saved every penny we could from our own salaries. We cut back on everything for 6 months. We didn't have enough to pay for the $80,000 gala my parents wanted, but we had enough for a beautiful, honest party if things went south. We sent out our own set of invitations to the people who actually mattered. We told them the truth, that there might be some drama, but we wanted them there. As the wedding day approached, the tension in my parents' house was thick enough to cut with a knife. They were so busy gloating about how refined the event was going to be that they didn't notice I was carrying a secret that was about to blow their polished world apart. They thought they had successfully scrubbed my life of anyone who didn't fit their brand. On the morning of the wedding, everything seemed perfect by their standards. The flowers were worth more than a modest house, the champagne was flowing, and the photographers were capturing every staged, sterile moment. But as I was getting into my dress, I saw the guest list for the reception sitting on the vanity. My parents had gone in and crossed out even more of my friends at the last minute, replacing them with a state senator and his wife. That was the moment something in me snapped. I realized that to them, I wasn't a daughter getting married. I was a prop in a play they were producing. I didn't say anything then. I waited. I waited until we were at the church. I waited until the guests were seated and the music started. And that brings us back to that moment at the back of the church, with my father's hand on my arm and his poisonous ultimatum ringing in my ears. He had found out. Someone, maybe a disgruntled assistant or a stray RSVP, had tipped him off that my unapproved guests were already sitting inside the church. He looked at me with such coldness and said, "There are people in those pews who do not belong. You will walk in there, and you will ensure they do not show up at the reception, or I am walking over to the venue manager right now and canceling the catering. You'll be standing in an empty hall with your charity cases and no food. Choice is yours, Olivia. Are you a daughter of this family, or are you one of them?" So that's the situation I was in. I was literally seconds away from walking down the aisle. And my father was threatening to humiliate me and my husband-to-be in front of everyone we knew unless I kicked out the people I cared about most. He thought the threat of losing the perfect wedding would break me. Before I tell you what I did next and how the rest of that day went down, I want you to pause and comment below. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have swallowed your pride to keep the peace and the party, or would you have called his bluff? I looked my father straight in the eyes, pulled my arm out of his grip, and said, "Then I guess you better start making some phone calls, Dad, because I'm not kicking a single soul out." His face went from pale to a deep, angry purple. He started to hiss that I was being ungrateful and that I was ruining my life, but I didn't stay to listen. I signaled the wedding coordinator, who I had secretly tipped off weeks ago about a potential change in plans, and I told her to open the doors. I didn't wait for my father to walk me down the aisle. I walked myself. As the doors swung open and the music swelled, I didn't look at the elegant society guests on the right side of the aisle. I looked at the left side. There they were. My kids from the youth center, wearing their best Sunday clothes, some in mismatched suits and others in simple dresses, all beaming with the purest joy I've ever seen. Sarah was there, crying happy tears. Leo was there, grinning like a madman. These were the people who had actually shown up for me when I was struggling, and seeing them there gave me all the strength I needed. I saw my mother's face as I walked past her row. She looked like she had just swallowed a lemon. She was looking at my guests with utter disgust, but I just gave her a wink and kept walking toward Mark. Mark was standing at the altar, looking like he'd just won the lottery. He knew what had just happened in the vestibule. He'd seen my father storming off toward the side exit. We exchanged our vows in front of a room filled with a bizarre mix of the elite and the unsuitable, and it was the most beautiful, honest moment of my life. When the ceremony ended, we walked out as husband and wife, ignoring my parents entirely. We headed to the reception venue, and sure enough, my father had tried to follow through on his threat. He had called the manager to cancel everything. But here's the thing about people who think money is the only language people speak. They forget about contracts. Mark and I had used our savings to sign a secondary, insurance agreement with the caterer and the venue weeks prior. We had told them that if my parents tried to pull the plug, we would cover a scaled-back version of the event ourselves. We didn't have the fancy steak and lobster anymore, but we had plenty of tacos, sliders, and an open bar that we'd paid for in advance. When the elite guests arrived at the reception, they were greeted not by a formal sit-down dinner, but by a high-energy, loud, and incredibly fun party. My parents showed up, expecting to see us standing in a dark, empty room. Instead, they saw me dancing with a group of teenagers from the center, while a local DJ we hired played music that was definitely not on my mother's approved classical playlist. The society friends were actually having a great time because, turns out, even rich people get bored of stiff weddings and actually enjoy a good taco. My father tried to make a scene, approaching me in front of everyone to demand respect for his contribution. I simply handed him a check, the exact amount of the deposit he'd paid that wasn't refundable, and told him, "Here is your money back. Since you didn't want to be a father today, you don't have to be a sponsor either. You and Mom are welcome to stay as guests, but if you say one more word about the rules, I'll have the security you paid for, by the way, escort you out." The look on his face was worth every penny of our savings. My mother spent the rest of the night sitting in a corner, refusing to eat peasant food, while my father eventually realized that his social standing would suffer more if he made a scene than if he just sat down and shut up. The aftermath was messy, as you can imagine. My parents didn't speak to me for 3 months. They told the rest of the family that I was brainwashed and that I had humiliated them. But the funny thing is, a lot of their friends actually reached out to me later and said it was the best wedding they'd been to in years because it felt real. Mark and I started our marriage with 0 debt, but also 0 savings, and we couldn't be happier. We realized that the rules my parents lived by were just a cage, and by refusing to play their game, we finally broke free. We don't have the big inheritance anymore, and we aren't invited to the country club Christmas party, but we have a home filled with people who love us for who we are, not for what we can do for their reputation. The moral of the story is that you can't put a price tag on your integrity. If you let people buy your silence or your choices, you'll eventually wake up and realize you don't own your own life anymore. It's better to have a taco in a room full of friends than a steak in a room full of strangers who are only there to judge you. My parents tried to use their wealth as a weapon, but they forgot that a weapon only works if the other person is afraid. Once I stopped being afraid of losing their money, they had no power over me. If you've ever had to stand up to your family to protect what's right, then you know exactly how I feel. Like this video if you were on my side and think I did the right thing by calling their bluff. Subscribe for more stories like this where we tackle family drama and standing your ground. Share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. Did I go too far by handing my dad that check, or was it the perfect final touch? I'll see you all in the next story.